Okay, Rabbi Sai, today's DAF is DAF Lamed at the very, very top of the Amud. We'll learn today Le'iloi Nishmas Rebitz and Judy Tab, Alea Shalom, Neshama should have an Aliyah. Okay, the Mishnah says, okay, we're going to see a series of Mishnayos today, and it's going to be necessary to hold cup, which means to keep everything in your head. To hold, not just to hold your cup. Okay. Shlosha achin, shnai mehen nesuin shtei achayos ve'echad nasui nachris. So we have our standard case of three brothers, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. Reuven and Shimon are married to two sisters, Leah and Rachel. And Levi, it turns out, is married to a woman who's not related at all. We call her the nachris, which means the foreign woman. In other words, a non-relative. Okay, so just keep that in mind. The word nachris means a non-related woman. Meis echa mibali achayos. So Reuven dies. V'kanas nosoi nachris is ishto. Levi goes ahead and legitimately does yibum with Reuven's widow, with Leah. Okay? Now, there's no problem because Shimon is still alive and Shimon's married to the living sister, so what's the big deal? Okay, umeis, and then Levi dies. Okay, so now Levi leaves over two widows. He leaves over a sister and he leaves over the nachris. So harishona yotza mishum achos isha, ushniya mishum tzarasa. So very, very straightforward case. This is a classic case of the first mission of Maseches Yevamos, where one woman is an erva for Shimon because she's achos ishto, it's his wife's sister, and the other woman is the tzara of an erva, tzaras achos ishto. So he can't do yibum or chalitza with either. They go scot-free to the shuk. However, asa b'maimer umeis. If, however, before Levi didn't do full yibum to Leah, but rather he just gave a mimer to Leah. I mean, as we learned, a mimer, at least according to Beis Hillel, is a rabbinic mechanism. So it only makes a rabbinic marriage, but midioraisa, he never really did yibum. So then what we have is a situation where the tzara, the nachris, is somewhat of a tzara of an erva, but somewhat not of a tzara of an erva, and therefore nachris choletzes v'lo misyabemes. So she has to do chalitza, she can't do yibum, because in one respect she's the tzara of an erva, but she doesn't get off scot-free because she's really not the tzara of an erva, and that's why it's chalitza, not yibum. Very straightforward. The Gemara now says, Taima da'avad ba'maimer. So the Gemara says, let's make the following diuk. The only reason why there's a problem of this woman, Levi's widow, the nachris, not being able to do yibum with Shimon is because Levi did a mimer. He gave her a mimer, so he connected her in some way to his other wife. Halo avad ba mimer nachris yivuminam biyabama. So by inference, if Levi had not done anything, in other words, Reuven died, Shimon and Levi are there. Shimon obviously can't do yibum because this is his sister-in-law, but Levi could do yibum or chalitza, but he does nothing. And then before he has a chance to do anything, Levi passes away. It seems from our Mishnah that it's perfectly legitimate for Shimon to go ahead and do yibum, full-blown yibum, with Levi's widow. What do you see from here? Amar of Nachman Zos Omeres Ein Zika va'afilu b'chadacha. It must be that our Mishnah is holding that there's no Zika over here, that there's a principle of no Zika, because if you hold of the principle of Zika, that as soon as a woman falls to Yibum, then she's like a pseudo-wife, so then it turns out that Levi's Nachris wife is a tzara of the pseudo-wife, which is an erva. So if that's the case, then even if Levi did nothing, it would not be permitted for Shimon to do Yibum to the Nachris. So we must infer from this Mishnah that Ein Zika. Now, this is Rav Nachman's inference. Just store that away in your memory banks. Tosfos says Akasha. You remember a long time ago there was this whole debate whether Yesh Zika or Ein Zika? We never brought this Mishnah in to try to prove Ein Zika, and yet this Mishnah is, for Rav Nachman, is definitive proof that Ein Zika. So this is Tosfos' question. He goes through the discussion. But let's go on to the next Mishnah. Keep this in mind. Keep Rav Nachman in mind. Rav Nachman says we can infer from this Mishnah the standard case of where Reuven dies and he leaves over Leah as the sister. Levi does nothing. The fact that Shimon can go ahead and do Yibum with the nachris is an indication that ein zika. Next case, Shlosha achim, shnai mehem nesuin shtei achayos ve'echad nasui nachris. Same permutation. Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. Reuven and Shimon are married to two sisters. Levi's married to a nachris. Meis hanasui nachris v'kanas echad mibale achayos es ishto. So here, instead of Reuven dying, what happens is first Levi dies. Levi is married to the nachris. He dies first. Reuven goes ahead and does yibum with the nachris, umeis, and then Reuven dies. Now Reuven leaves over two wives. He leaves over his original wife, which is a sister-in-law to Shimon, plus he leaves over this new wife of his, which is the tzara of achos ishto. So it would seem the exact same case as the previous Mishnah, just in reverse. Harishona yotzeis mishum achos isha. So Reuven's first wife gets off scot-free because she's Shimon's sister-in-law, so she's an erva to Shimon, and therefore he can't do yibum or chalitza. Ushniya mishum tzarasa. And the second wife, which means Levi's wife, Levi's widow, who Reuven did yibum to, also is the tzara of an erva. Okay, what's the problem?
I'm confused. Aren't all of those wives of Reuven sisters-in-law of the other brother?
Once again, let's go through it. Reuven and Shimon are married to two sisters. Levi's married to a woman who's not related to the other two women. So Levi dies. Reuven can do yibum with her. He does do yibum.
Right, but by conventional language, isn't that a sister-in-law still? Well, the way we call it today.
Of course, but what's the mitzvah of yibum? To do yibum to your sister-in-law.
Right.
When I say sister-in-law, what do I mean? Achos ishto. Achos ishto, the sister of your wife. Sorry. Okay. Achos ishto is what we mean when we say sister-in-law. Okay. So anyway, so umeis. So Reuven now dies. He leaves over two wives. He leaves over the sister, and he leaves over the nachris. So Harishona yotzis mishum achos isha. So the first wife of Reuven, of course, is an erva to Shimon. So Shimon can't do yibum or chalit, so she gets off scot-free. Ushniya mishum tzarasa, and the second wife gets off because she's a tzara of an erva. Asa b'maimer umeis. If, however, instead of marrying Levi's widow, Reuven simply gives her a mimer, so there's a partial marriage and a partial non-marriage. So nachris choletzes v'lo misyabemes. So therefore, once again, the widow of Levi, who was only partially married to Reuven, and therefore is only partially a tzaras erva, she gets chalitza, but she can't do yibum. So the Gemara's question is pretty obvious. Hasu lamali, hainu hach. The Gemara says, why do you need two mishnayos to reflect the same case? In both situations, the Mishnah is telling me the case of erva and the case of tzaras erva. The case of erva and the case of where she's not mamish at tzaras erva because there was only a mimer instead of there being a full-blown yibum. What's the difference? And not only that, but the Mishnah's argument is even further. The Gemara's argument is even further. If anything, the first Mishnah is a bigger chiddush than the second Mishnah. Why? Because hashta uma hasam da'achos isha hav yitzara lenachris amart nachris asura hacha de nachris hav yitzara la'achos isha lo kol shekain. The Gemara says, let's go back to the first case. In the first case, the primary wife in the situation where Reuven dies, the primary wife is the achos isha, is Shimon's erva. In the first case, however, that's the second case. In the first case, however, think about it. Who was the primary wife? The primary wife is where we reverse the case. First, Reuven dies in the first Mishnah. First Reuven dies. Levi does yibum to her, but Levi already has a primary wife, which is the nachris. And then he takes on a secondary wife, who's now the tzara to the nachris. And yet we still say that when they both fall to yibum for Shimon, the nachris cannot do yibum. She can only do chalitza, even if Shimon only did a mimer, right? And if he did a full-blown yibum, then there's no yibum and no chalitza. Now, in that situation, the secondary wife is the erva. And yet we still say that the nachris is called a tzaras erva, even though she's the main wife. then surely in a situation where the main wife, the primary wife, is an erva, and the secondary wife is a nachris, which is the second Mishnah, then surely we should say that the nachris can't do yibum, she can only do chalitza when there's a mimer involved. Like, if anything, the first Mishnah is even bigger chiddush than the second Mishnah. So once you've told me the first Mishnah, why do you need the second Mishnah? So the Gemara says, you're asking a good question, and this is really the way it works. Tana hach tana bereisha, v'hach chazya lehetera v'sharya, v'hader chazya le'isura, v'aida dechaviva le aktama u'mishna lo zaza mimakoma. The answer is as follows. Really, this second case, where first Levi dies, his wife is yibumed by Ruvain, and now Ruvain dies second. That really was the first case that our Tana dealt with. And that was quite straightforward to him. It was quite obvious that in a situation where the connection of this nachris is only through a mimer, since she's a secondary wife to an erva, she for sure, you can't do yibum, you can only do chalitza, even though there's only a mimer. The first case, he was deliberating. He was equivocating that perhaps you could argue that in the first case, which of the first Mishnah, since the primary wife, after all, that Levi has is the nachris, and only the secondary wife is the erva, maybe you could argue that since he only gave a mimer to the erva, maybe that does not disqualify the nachris from having full-blown yibum. But then he said, you know what, at the end of the day, halachically, there's not going to be any difference. It makes no difference whether the real marriage is with the nachris or whether the real marriage is with the erva. At the end of the day, if there is a mimer connection from one to the other, then we have to disqualify both of them from yibum, and therefore the nachris will always have to get chalitza. And therefore he concluded with the first Mishnah afterwards. So then, why did he put the second Mishnah first, like the second halacha? Why did he put that as the first Mishnah? Says the Gemara, because it's a bigger chiddush, so it was more chaviv to him. It's a more precious halacha. Since it's a bigger chiddush, the Tana wanted to write it first because it was exciting, right? It was dear to him, and since he had already taught the other halacha first, he kept it here as well. So therefore, the Gemara's real answer is, you're right. In Achinami, once you have the first Mishnah, you don't really need the second Mishnah. But the second Mishnah was taught first, and therefore it stays in.
Could you indict from this in a suffix mimer that it would be repealed?
Don't complicate it, Reb David. Let's go. You're going to see. It's going to get complicated enough. So don't ask me the what ifs today. Today's not a day for what ifs. Let's go on to the next Mishnah. Shlosha achin shnayim mehem nesuin shtei achayos ve'echad nasli nachris. You have once again three brothers, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. Reuven and Shimon are married to Leah and Rachel. One of them, Levi, is now married to the nachris. Meis echad mi balei achayos ve'konas nasli nachris es ishto. Reuven dies. Levi goes ahead and does full yibum with his widow, with Leah. Umeisa ishto shel sheni. Then look what happens. Then Shimon's wife Rachel dies. Shimon's wife Rachel dies. Now, ve'achar kach meis nasui nachris, and then Levi dies. So who's left? Who's left standing? Shimon is standing, and Levi's two wives are left standing. One of them is a nachris, and the other one is Shimon's former sister-in-law, meaning that it was his wife's sister, but his wife is now out of the picture. Now you could argue that since we know that there's a halacha that if your wife dies you can marry her sister, you could argue that he can do yibum with either one that he wants. Neither one of them is an erva at this point. However, the Mishnah does not say that. Harezu asura alav olamis, hol v'nesra alav shah echas. Leah is forbidden to him forever, since what? Since when Reuven died, this woman, Leah, fell to both Shimon and Levi, potentially for Yibum, and Shimon was not able to do Yibum because at that time he was his sister-in-law. Then at that point, she becomes permanently usher because of the erva of Eshes Ach. She becomes permanently Eishes Ach, and therefore, even though at some point later she's no longer his wife's sister because his wife is deceased, she is permanently usher to him from then on, and therefore he cannot do yibum with her. What's the status of the nachris? The Mishnah does not address that. Tosfos says, presumably, since this woman is an erva of Eishesach, so then the tzara is a tzaras erva. Tosfos doesn't really understand why the Mishnah doesn't, for comprehensive purposes, address that issue, but we're going to put that aside for now. The Gemara now says, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Kol Yevama she'enani koriba b'shas nefila Yevama yavoa aleha, harehi ke'eshes ach sheyesh labanim ve'asura. Anytime a Yevama falls for Yibum at the time of her husband's death, if she's not Yibumable at that moment, then she is permanently precluded as an erva, so that even if she becomes yibumable later because the reason for the erva is removed, it's too late. She permanently sustains the stigma of an eishesach. So it's as if she had children with her deceased husband, and therefore she's permanently usher to the brother. Maikamash malantanina. So the question is, Shkoyach Rav, what are you telling me that I don't already know from a Mishnah? We just learned it in this Mishnah. Harezu asura alav olam is hol v'nesr alav shah echas. That's exactly what our Mishnah says. That even though at the time when when Leah falls for Yibum, Rachel is deceased, Shimon is still not allowed to do Yibum with Leah because at one point she was usher to him. So the Gemara says, I'll tell you what Rav is teaching me. Mahu detema hani mili heicha delo ichazya la benefila rishona. The answer is that if you look carefully at our case, when Leah falls to Yibum, and Shimon and Levi are both alive, at no point during that first Zika was Leah Yibumable to Shimon. Levi goes ahead and does Yibum with her, and it's only after Levi removes the Zika from Reuven's death does Shimon's wife die. So maybe you would have thought that that's the reason why Leah is permanently precluded from Shimon, because during that entire period of Zika there was no Yibum ability to Leah whatsoever. But let's say in a more simple case, let's say a case where there's only two brothers, Reuven and Shimon, who are married to two sisters. And in a situation where Reuven dies and then Shimon's wife dies, maybe you could have argued that since it's still a Zika from Reuven's death, maybe at that point, once Shimon's wife dies, she is Yibumable again. Maybe you could have argued that without Rav's statement, and therefore, from our Mishnah, you have no raya. Rav wants to make sure you understand, under no circumstances, if she was not Yibumable at the time of death, under no circumstances can you do Yibum at some later point. That's the Chiddush. But wait a minute, says the Gemara, Hanami Tanina. But that point also we're going to learn in a Mishnah on DAF Lamed Beis. Because in the Mishnah on DAF Lamed Beis says, Shnei Achim Nesun Shtei Achais, with the case I just told you. Reuven and Shimon are married to two sisters, Leah and Rachel. Meis Echad Mehem, V'achar Kach Meis Ishto. If Reuven dies, and then Shalsheni, and then Shimon's wife dies, Harezu Asura Lav Olam is Holvin Esra Lav Shah Echas. It says quite explicitly that very simple case, that if Shimon's wife dies after Reuven dies, Shimon can never do Yibum with Reuven's widow, because at the time of Reuven's death she was not Yibumable. So the Gemara says, no, still you need Rab's halacha, because Mahu de Tema, Hasam hu de Idchila mehai Beisa legamre. Because maybe in that case, the reason why she's permanently stigmatized, this woman Leah, is because Shimon was the only brother available. And because he was the only brother available, and there was no one else who could do Yibum with her, she is permanently precluded from that house, and therefore she's permanently stigmatized. But our case is not as simple. In our case, when Reuven dies, there are two brothers. And the woman is Yibumable, just not to Shimon. And therefore you might have thought that in a situation like that, if Shimon's wife were to pass away before Levi does anything, you might have thought that, well, since she was still shayach to this house because of Levi, like she was still tethered because of Levi's Yibum ability to her, now that Shimon's wife has died, she's still Yibumable now to Shimon. Comes along Rav to tell me, so you might have thought mistakenly she can do Yibum with Shimon. Now, Kamash Malan, Rav says that no. Once she's precluded at the moment of death, she is permanently precluded. Next Mishnah. Shlosha achim, shnayim hem nesum shtei achayas vechad nasui nachris. Standard case once again. Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. Reuven and Shimon are married to Leah and Rachel. Levi is married to the Nachris. Giresh echad mibalei achayos es ishto. Reuven goes ahead and divorces his wife Leah. That's the new case, okay? Remember, Reuven divorces his wife Leah. And then, umeis nasui Nachris, and then Levi dies. Vikansa hamagaresh, and then Reuven, he's a single man, he says, you know what, I'll do Yibum. I don't have a wife now, I'll do Yibum. So he goes ahead and does Yibum with the Nachris. Reuven is now married only to whom? To the Nachris. Shimon is married to? Rachel, to the sister. Okay, so, but Leah is divorced. She's not married to anyone anymore. Leah's divorced, but she's still Rachel's sister. Umeis. And then Reuven dies. So Zuhi Sha'amru v'kulan shemeso niskarshu tsarosein mutaros. This is the classic example of where the Mishnah, the very first Mishnah of Maseches Yevamos, said that in a situation where the erva dies or is divorced before the man dies, then the tzara falls completely for Yibum or Chalitza, because at the time of death, the tzara is not a tzaras erva. So since, even though it's true that Reuven at one time was married to an erva to Shimon, but at the time of Reuven's death, he's not married to an erva anymore. And therefore the tzara that he's married to, which is the Nachris, completely falls for Yibum and Chalitza to Shimon. Shimon can do either one. Okay, is that clear? All right, so now put on your seatbelts. The Gemara now says, Taima degiresh v'achar kach meis. So the Gemara says that's the only reason why this whole halacha is true is because first Reuven divorced his wife, and only then Levi died. In other words, because before there was any Zika, Reuven got rid of his wife Leah. Avol meis v'achar kach giresh. But what would happen the opposite? It sounds like from our Mishnah that if Levi dies first, and now this woman is Zekuka, now to both Reuven and Shimon, and then Reuven divorces his wife, Asura. Then if Reuven were to do Yibum with this Nachris, and then Reuven would die, she would not be allowed to do, the Tzara would not be allowed to do Yibum to Shimon. Why? Because she would be a Tzara of an erva through Zika. Because remember we said that Zika creates a pseudo marriage. So if Reuven has a pseudo marriage through Zika to Levi's Nachris, even before he's done anything to her, but it's the Zika that binds them, then the fact that Levi's Nachris is now a wife of Reuven, it turns out that she's the tzara of an erva through Zika. So the Gemara says, you see from here, Amar Rav Ashi Zos Omeres Yesh Zika Afilu B'Trei Achi. This proves to us that Zika is so powerful that it can create a case of a tzaras erva, even though the Zika is with two brothers. Now, when the Zika is with one brother, we said the Zika is even stronger because it's directed specifically to one person. Here, the Zika from Levi's death, this Nachris is now Zekuka to two brothers. But we still say that she's still considered to be pseudo-married to Reuven, to the point where if Reuven would only after Levi's death, divorce his wife, we would still say, but at least for temporarily, this Nachris was a tzara to Reuven's wife. Sarah to an erva, and therefore permanently precludes Shimon from ever doing Yibum with her.
I thought this concept of Sefer Krisos is completely cut off. So like a get should be, that's it. There shouldn't be
she is, but if this Mishnah is implying that if there's any moment where this woman was a tzara to an erva, the tzara is permanently precluded. Even if all our Mishnah has told us is that if Reuven divorces his wife first and then he marries the erva, or then he marries the Nachris rather, then one is never a tzara to the other. But if there's even a moment where the two are tsaros to each other, so then the tzara of the erva is permanently precluded. So the Gemara says, Rav Ashi kasha de Rav Nachman. So the Gemara says, Rav Ashi's correct inference from our Mishnah tells me that Zika creates a situation of tsaras erva. Well, if that's the case, that yesh Zika from this Mishnah, what are you going to do about the previous Mishnah on the top of the Amud, where Rav Nachman said that this indicates that ain't Zika? Now remember, go back to that original case. The original case in the top Mishnah was that in a situation where the Ruvain dies, and Levi goes ahead and does Yibum to, Levi does nothing. Levi does nothing to that woman, and then Levi dies. Rav Nachman said we can infer from that Mishnah that Levi's widow, the Nachris, can have Yibum with Shimon. What about the Zika? What about the fact that Ruvain's wife is Zakuka to Levi? So Rav Nachman said, you see from here, Ein Zika. You see that Zika doesn't create problems. And here we're proving just the opposite. So make up your mind. The first Mishnah says Ein Zika. This Mishnah now implies Yesh Zika. So which one is it? So Amar L'cha Rav Ashi, Hu Hadin Da'af Al Gav Delo Avid B'Maimer Nachris Micheles Chaltza Yevumi Lo Miyabema. So Rav Ashi says Rav Nachman made an incorrect inference. In reality, that first Mishnah would also admit that in a case where Levi did nothing to Leah, it would not be permitted for Shimon to do Yibum with the Nachris. He would always have to give her Chalitza. Then why did the Mishnah talk about a case where Levi gave her a mimer, and only in that situation did we say that Shimon has to give her Chalitza, can't do Yibum? Not to tell me that if he does nothing, she's yibumable, but rather v'hadikatani maimer la'afu kemi beis Shammai. To Amri maimer kaina kinyan gamor kamash malan delo kebeis Shammai. The chiddush is that we want to make sure that you understand that we don't paskin like beis Shammai. Now, according to beis Shammai, a maimer is what? It's not a rabbinic marriage. A maimer is a complete marriage, like we learned yesterday. And if that's the case, then according to Beis Shammai, if Levi were to give a mimer to Leah, then she would be completely his wife, to the point where if Levi then dies after the mimer, not only can you not do Yibum to the Nachris, but she's not even subject to Chalitza because she's Mamash at Tzaras Erva. So therefore, the Mishnah wants to teach me, don't paskin like Beis Shammai. A mimer is only a rabbinic marriage, and therefore, if Levi gives her a mimer and then Levi dies, you still have to do chalitza. But that's not to teach you the other thing. Really, in reality, even if Levi gives her nothing, the tzara, the nachris, is still subject to only chalitza because of the zika that existed between Levi and Leah. Okay, so the Gemara now says, Ula Rav Nachman kasha de Rav Ashi. All right, so you've for Rav Ashi, you've explained how Rav Ashi is going to learn the first Mishnah. But how's Rav Nachman, who says from the first Mishnah you see Ein Zika, how's he going to learn this latter Mishnah? So v'chite mahu hadin de'afilu meis v'achar kach giresh sarasa muteres. So maybe you'll tell me, so remember now, what are we saying? We're saying that our Mishnah says that it's davka in a situation where Ruvain first divorces his wife and then Levi dies. So there's not even Zika that connects these two women. Only in that situation can Shimon do Yibum with Levi's widow, the Nachris. But in a situation where first Levi died and then Ruvain divorced his wife, it seems from our Mishnah that if Ruvain does Yibum and then Ruvain dies, then this Nachris, when she falls to Shimon, is considered to be a Tzaras Erva. So you see from here that there is this thing of Zika that creates this tzara situation. So how is Rav Nachman going to explain it? So maybe you'll tell me no. Hu hadin de'afilu meis v'achar kach giresh sarasa muteres. So maybe you'll tell me no. The Mishnah is not excluding that case. Maybe our Mishnah agrees that even in a situation where first Levi dies and then Ruvain divorces Leah, and then Ruvain does Yibum with the Nachris, and then Ruvain dies, it'll still be mutter for Shimon to go ahead and do Yibum. So Elazuhi Lema'ute Mai. So then the question is, why did the Mishnah make a point of saying that this is a case of where the first Mishnah Yevamos said that when the woman is already divorced, then you don't have to worry about Saras Erva. When the Erva is already divorced, you don't have to worry about Saras Erva. What do you mean this? What is it coming to exclude? According to what you're saying, that even in a case where there was Zika that connected the Nachris and the Erva, we still say that since it was only Zika, but Rav Nachman says ain't Zika, and therefore it's okay to do Yibum with her. So what is it coming to exclude? So the more answer is L'ma'ute kanas v'achar kach giresh. I'll tell you what it's coming to exclude. In a situation where Ruvain mamash marries, where he mamash marries Levi's widow, the Nachris, and then he divorces his wife, and then he dies, that's the case where our Mishnah would hold that since they were co-wives to each other, even temporarily, then the Nachris cannot fall to Yibum for Shimon. That's what our Mishnah is coming to exclude. But in Hachinami, Rav Nachman will tell you, there's no principle of Zika that's going to make someone into a Tsaras Erva. Zika alone does not make a woman into a Tsaras Erva, but it's only when they were mamish married. So now the Gemara says, but wait a minute, we got to take this one step further. Hanicha isavrla kerebi Yirmiyah. Now we have to go back. On DAF Yud Gimel, we had cited this Mishnah on DAF Lamed. On DAF Yud Gimel, we had talked about this principle because the first Mishnah in Maseches Yevamos seems to have been saying that in all cases of divorce, the tzara is not a tzaras erva. In all cases. So the Gemara's question is, what do you mean in all cases? So Rabbi Yirmiyah had said it means that even if there was a time when both women were the co-wives simultaneously to Ruvain, as long as Ruvain divorced the erva before he dies, the tzara is not called the tzaras erva. Now, if that's the case, so hanicha isarvela kerebi Yirmiyah the Amar Tavra misha shana zulo shana zu v'haitana savra misa mapelas v'haitana savra nisuna shuna mapilim zuhi lamute kanas l'basov giresh. So it turns out Rabbi Yirmiyah had said that based upon what the first Mishnah Yevamos teaches, that even if they're co-wives, mamish co-wives together, the first Mishnah holds that as long as Ruvain divorced her before he died, the tzara is not, the nachris is not a tzaras erva. And Rabbi Yirmiyah had said, well, what are you going to do with our Mishnah? Our Mishnah seems to imply just the opposite, that even if they're married for a moment as the same as co-wives of the same man, then even if Ruvain divorces the erva, the woman still does not fall to Yibum. So Rabbi Yirmiyah said that's a good kasha, and the only way to answer it is that it's a machlokas tanoim. Whoever taught the first Mishnah does not teach the Mishnah in Daf Lamed, and vice versa. Because according to the first Mishnah, you look at what happens at the time of death. If at the time of death they're not married, so then this woman is not a tzaras erva. Our Mishnah looks at it as what was the status at the time of their marriage. If at the time of the marriage they were co-wives, so then this woman is a tzaras erva, even if at Reuven's death she's not a tzaras erva. So that would work out. Elei sarver la kerava da'amar la'olam chatanahu ve'ein sarach lomar zu kitani zuhi l'mu'utei mai. But Rava disagrees. Rava is of the opinion that in both the first Mishnah in Yevamos and our Mishnah on Daf Lamed, in both cases, if the women are, if as long as the erva is not married at the time of Reuven's death, then the tzara is not a tzaras erva. So then what is our Mishnah coming to exclude? Even in a case where they were both co-wives at the same time, as long as Reuven divorced Leah before he died, then the tzara is not a tzaras erva. So why is the Mishnah coming to give me an exclusionary clause of only in this case is she not a tzaras erva, but in other cases she will be a tzaras erva? So the Gemara answers, Al karchach kerebi Yirmiyah svirale. You have to say that Rav Nachman, who holds Ein Zika, must hold like Rabbi Yirmiyah that our Mishnah disagrees with the first Mishnah, and not like Rava, who says that they are in accord with each other. So now the Gemara says, well, let's go in the other direction. Ula Rava, now according to Rava, who says that both the first Mishnah and this Mishnah hold that as long as the erva is not married at the time of Reuven's death, the tzara is not a tzara zerva, hanicha isarvala keravashi, zuhi lemuute meis below giresh. So then we have to figure out what is the exclusionary clause in our Mishnah coming to exclude. It's not coming to exclude a case of tzara. Like Rashi points out, he says, "V'lo daik lemasnisin keravashi da'amar hu hameis ve'achar kach giresh asura daharava misa mapeles virale." Rava holds that at the time of death, that's what you look at. You look at the time of death, and if they're not married at the time of death, if Reuven's not married to the erva, the tzara is not a tzaras erva. V'keven de giresh arya elahachi daik. But rather the diuk is like this. Taima de giresh de bishas misa lav tzaros havu zulazu. Tzaros. So havu zuhi denachris muteris. That it seems from our Mishnah that it's only because Reuven divorced Leah that the tzara is not considered to be a tzaras erva. Avol meis sheni ze achar rishon v'lo gireshes ishto. But if Reuven died without divorcing Leah, and Levi died first, leaving over a nachris, then Reuven dies and leaves over his widow, va'afilu lo konas es hanachris asura, then even if Reuven had never married or done anything to the nachris is going to be usher to Shimon, the havai tzaras achos isha bezika, because this tzara, this nachris is a tzara through zika of Reuven's widow. Va'afilu bishas misa the kaven diyesh zika havi ki'ilu ba af mikoach hasheni, and therefore, because of zika, we look at this woman, this nachris, even though she was never a co-wife of Reuven's widow, we look at her as being a co-wife because of the power of zika. If that's the case, then the only way that you could understand our Mishnah is the Mishnah is telling me only because Reuven divorced his wife do we look at the nachris as not a tzaras erva. But if Reuven never divorced his wife, then this woman would be a tzaras erva because of Rav Ashi's principle of zika. But that only works if you hold of zika. But what if you don't hold of zika? Then why should the nachris be usher just because Reuven never divorced his wife? So the Gemara answers, you're right. Al karchach karav ashi svirale. You must conclude that in order for this Mishnah's exclusionary clause to make any sense, to be excluding anything, according to Rava, it must be coming to exclude that case because Rava holds of zika. So in the final analysis, the Gemara says that if you're holding like Rav Nachman must be aligned with Rabbi Yirmiyah. And if you're holding like Rava must be aligned like Rav Ashi, who holds Yesh Zika. If that made sense to you, then you have a perverted mind. Okay, the Mishnah now says, I mean, it makes a lot of sense, but the fact that you can understand this, that you can follow this, it takes all of my energy just to be able to say it. For you to be able to hear it and to be able to absorb it, I can't believe it. I mean, you must be a genius.
Come back to Gukshachim.
Okay, next go on to the next Mishnah. V'kulan shahayu bahen kiddushin o gerushin b'safek harei elu hatzaras cholzos v'lo misyabamos. And the next Mishnah says that in all situations where there was only a safek kiddushin or a safek get with an erva, and there's two wives. One is an erva and one is a tzara. And there's only a suffix whether the erva is married, either because there was a suffix of kiddushin or a suffix of a get. So then the halacha is that tzara has to get chalitza, she can't do yibum. So keitzat safek kiddushin, what's an example of a safek kiddushin? Zarak la kiddushin, safek karov lo, safek karov la, zehu safek kiddushin. So the classic example of a suffix where a woman's married or not is that you know that if you present a woman with a ring, she's married. What if you take a ring and you say, Hariyat mikudeshes li betabazu, and you put it back in your pocket? That's not a kiddushin because you have to present it to her. What if there's a suffix whether you gave it to her or not? Let's say you threw a ring towards her, and there's a suffix whether it landed within her dalet amos closer to her or within your dalet amos closer to you. And then she agrees and she accepts it, but then a wind blows it away, and now you don't know whether she's mekudeshes or not. So in that situation, the Gemara says, if she's an erva to your brother, and you have another wife, and then you die, so then it's a suffix whether this tzara is a tzaras erva or not, and therefore she has to get chalitza. Suffix gerushin, what's the case of a suffix whether something's a get or not? So you would have thought that the Mishnah could have given the exact same example. You throw a get to a woman, you're not sure whether it landed closer to her or closer to you, and therefore we say it's a suffix get. But that's not the case that the Mishnah chooses, and the Gemara is going to explain why not. Here it is. Kosaf biksav yado ve'en alav edim. So here we're talking about a get where we know for sure she got the get. And we know that halachically, b'di'eved, this get works. Now what do I mean b'di'eved, the get works? Let's say a woman gets a get that's faulty in some way, and she goes ahead and remarries and has children. So even though the get was faulty, b'di'eved, we will say that we're not going to render these children as mamzerim because of a faulty get. But lechatchila, she needs to get another get. So that's the case of suffix that we're dealing with when it comes to gittin. You gave the erva a faulty get, and therefore the tzara is subject to chalitza. So what are some examples of a faulty get? Kosaf biksav yado ve'en olav edim. You write in your own handwriting the get, so we can identify that you wrote it, but we don't have edim who signed it. That's one example of a faulty get. Yesh olav edim ve'en bozman. Another example is where the witnesses sign it, but there's no date written on the get. And a third example is yesh bozman ve'en bo ela eid echad, or there's a date written on the get, but there's only one witness who signs it. All of these examples are zehu safek gerushin. So the Gemara now says, v'ilu begerushin safek karov lo v'safek karov la lo ketani my timer. Why didn't the Mishnah give a simple example of where you threw the get towards her and you're not sure whether it landed closer to her or closer to you? Why didn't you use the same example? So Amar Rabba isha zu becheskas heter l'shuk omedes umisafek atabola osra alta asrena misafek. So the answer is very simple. Since this woman had a chazaka previously as being a tsaras erva, to the point where if Ruvain would die without having given her a get at all, the presumption would be is that she could get off scot-free without yibum or chalitza because she's a tsaras erva. So because she has that chazaka of being mutter to the shuk, we're not going to remove that off of her unless we know for sure she got something. She had to have gotten something. So just the suffix, whether she even got a get or not, is not enough to remove that chazaka or presumption of heter for her to the shuk. So Amar le'abaye ihachi b'kiddusha nami isha zu b'cheskas heter liyavam omedes umisafek atabala osra alte asrena misafek. Well, if that's the case, then take the case of kiddushin, where there's a suffix whether you married an erva, Shimon's erva, or not. So without the kiddushin at all, Ruvain's other wife would not be a tsaras erva, and it would be permitted for her to have yibum with Shimon once Ruvain dies. Now, because of this suffix, you're rendering her usher to Shimon. On what basis? Give her, leave her with her chazaka of being mutter to do yibum with Shimon, and assume that the kiddushin is not a kiddushin. By the very same token, that in the parallel case of get, you assume that the get is not a get. So the Gemara says hasam l'chumra. The answer is because it's a chumra. We're machmir that we're not going to allow her to do yibum with Shimon out of a chashash that maybe Ruvain was really married to the erva. So it's a chumra. But the Gemara says, but that's not a chumra. It's not totally a chumra because hay chumra da asili de kulu. But it's a chumra that's going to lead to a kula. You know why? Because zimnin da azulhu umakadesh la la'achosa kiddushay vadai. What would happen if after Ruvain gives a safek kiddushin to the erva, to Shimon's erva, and then he goes ahead and gives vadai for sure kiddushin to this woman's sister? Now, in that situation, if you were to presume that this woman is completely not married, then, or if you were to presume that this woman is married, and therefore you require, that's why you won't let this the tzara do yibum, it's going to come to a chumrah. Because people will then say, well, the fact that this woman is getting a chalitza and not doing yibum is an indication that Reuven was really married to the erva. If that's the case, then the kiddushin that he gave to the sister of the erva is not a kiddushin at all. People will come to let her go and remarry without having to get a get from Reuven, and her kids will be a safek mamzerim. And v'inami zimnim da'asa acher makadesh la ledida kiddushay vadat. And or alternatively, let's say Reuven gives safek kiddushin to this woman who's an erva to Shimon, and then another person gives her vadai kiddushin. If you're going to go tell the tzara to do only chalitza, not yibum, people say, oh, she can only do chalitza, not yibum. You know why? Because Reuven was really married to the erva, And therefore, the kiddushin that the second guy gave her is not a kiddushin at all, and therefore he doesn't have to give her a get, nothing. The kevin da asar lomar litzar liyibume amri dekama kiddushin or the basar lav kiddushin. In both cases, people are going to say the fact that you're requiring her to get chalitza and not yibum, people are going to assume, therefore, that Reuven really was married to this erva, and any subsequent kiddushin that she received or that her sister received is invalid. So the Gemara says, so you see how it's going to come to a kula if you do this chumrah to only allow Shimon to do chalitza, not yibum. So the Gemara says no. Kevin de kamatzrichas chalitza made the yadi de chumrah ba'almahu. The Gemara says no. Just saying that she can only get chalitza is not an indication that she vadai can't get yibum. People will say that it's a chumrah. It's a chumrah, and therefore it's not that people are going to assume, it must be he was really vadai married to the erva. People will know that it's a chumrah. So the Gemara says, I hachi gerish shenami. Listening, v'litzracha chalitza u'meida yadi d'chumra ba'almahu. So, like Rashi explains, well, if that's the case, then do the same thing by gittin. Say, the case of get is where it's a suffix whether he threw it closer to her or whether he threw it closer to him, and people will understand. Like Rashi says, Kolomer ichaishus lo lemra inshi midachalza vade gerishin gemura ninhu. The very fact that just because you're requiring chalitza is not an indication that people will know that she was for sure divorced. De'i kaddish la lemigureshes inish da'alma v'hadar kaddish la'achosa de kamaisa kaddish de basraisa lav kiddushin lo seichosh lache de medlom yisyabemis tzarasa mei de yadi de chalitzu chumra ba'almahu. There's people will think that it's just a chumrah. And if it's just the chumrah, that we're just requiring you to do chalitza instead of letting this woman go off scot-free, or letting you do full-blown yibum, people will understand that, in other words, really like what we were saying all along. When you give a suffix get to this woman, you assume that the chazaka is that this tzara is muteris to the shuk, right? And no one's going to think that she's not muteris to the shuk by your chumrah of requiring chalitza to the point where they're going to think that this woman is for sure divorced, because they know that it's only a chumrah to require chalitza. So why don't you just require chalitza of this woman in the case of the safek get? So the Gemara says, no, because imata omer choletzes misyabemes. We're worried that if you say that this woman requires chalitza, and really in reality the chazaka says that she's a tzaras erva, people will say that if she got chalitza, she can also do yibum. And the problem is that if people are going to say that she can do yibum, then it's going to turn out that Shimon might do yibum with her, and when in reality she's a tzaras erva, which means that she herself is an erva veishasach, and that's going to be a disaster. But frek the Gemara hachanami imata omer choletzes misyabemes. So the Gemara says, well, then why don't you say the same fear by the previous case, by Kiddushin? If your whole concern is we really have a chazaka that this woman is allowed to do yibum, but we're going to require her to do chalitza because of the suffix, even though the suffix really doesn't remove the chazaka. But why aren't you worried that if we're going to require her to do chalitza, people will say that really she can do yibum? So the Gemara says, but in the first case, v'tisyabim ve'in bekach klum, achazaka kakaima. But that's talk of the reality, because in the event that we tell her to get chalitza, she really could do yibum, because the chazaka says that the erva is not really Ruvain's wife, and therefore this tsara is not a tsaras erva. And if that's the case, what's the worst case scenario? By telling her to get chalitza, people will come to think she could do yibum with Shimon. Hey, let her do yibum with Shimon. She's not an erva based on the chazaka, and therefore no destructive thing will come out of it. And therefore, in the final analysis, the Gemara says, the reason why we have a case of Safek Kiddushin is because even though the chazaka says, by Safek Kiddushin, the chazaka says that really he's not married to the erva, and really this tzara is not a tzaras erva, and therefore she's mutter to Shimon, but she's allowed to do yibum to Shimon, but we're only going to let her do chalitza. And what's the worst that'll happen? People will say, well, if she can get chalitza, she can do yibum? No, so she'll do yibum. Halachically, she's allowed to do yibum. But in the opposite case, where there's a suffix, where Reuven is for sure married to the erva, and then he gives her a suffix get, like the kind that we mentioned by Kiddushin, where he's not sure whether she landed in her vicinity or not. Really, the Chazaka says that this tzara is still a tzaras erva, and she's muteris l'shuk. If you're going to require her to get chalitza in that situation, people will think that she's subject to yibum to Shimon, and if Shimon does yibum to her, that's a disaster, because then it's mamash and erva to him, and that's why the Mishnah says that in that situation where it's karav suffix karav lo, safek karav la, it's not sure who it landed closer to, we still say that the tzara gets off scot-free without chalitza and without yibum. You all have a wonderful day.